afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming to the Research, Reflection and Practice platform. And this is our learning platform. It's our 7th guest lecture. So we have Mr. Sunil Bastian, who's well known to CEPA, to speak to us today. So welcome, Sunil. And he will be talking to us on the challenges of post-colonial state formation in Sri Lanka. So to give a little introduction to Sunil, Sunil Bastian is a political economist and an independent writer. His current research interests are politics of state formation and development of capitalism in Sri Lanka and development aid. In this regard, Mr. Bastian has published widely and is the editor of Devolution and Development in Sri Lanka. He has co-edited with Nicola Bastian, Assessing Participation, a debate from South Asia, and with Robin Luckham, Can Democracy Be Designed? The Politics of Institutional Choice in Conflict-Torn Societies, published by Said Press, London. His most recent publication is on the Sustaining a State in Conflict, Politics of Foreign Aid in Sri Lanka, Colombo, ICS. Other interesting work is also related to foreign aid, the politics of foreign aid in Sri Lanka, promoting markets and supporting peace. And also he has been the author of many journal articles. Mr. Bastian studied at the University of Uppsala in Sweden, and he has a postgraduate diploma in peace and conflict resolution. His contribution to academia actually has been in peace and conflict studies. And also, interestingly, he has done a degree in geology at the University of Leningrad in the former Soviet Union, but has moved out of that field and into peace and conflict subsequently. Mr. Bastian was a senior research fellow at the International Center for Ethnic Studies, Colombo, and was also one of our earliest chairpersons. I would now like to invite Mr. Bastian to talk to us on the challenges of post-colonial state formation in Sri Lanka. Over to you, sir.
Thanks for this chance to share with you all what I'm working on. I mean, what I thought was my kind of very brief presentation will consist of kind of 3 parts. First, what motivated me in getting into this. I'm working on a manuscript, post-colonial challenges of post-colonial state formation. Hopefully, I might finish it by the end of this month. First, I'll say what motivated me to come into this topic. Then, most importantly, I like to explain my conceptual framework, and then finally, how it applies to Sri Lanka. Well, what motivated me was actually from the time I started my career in Sri Lanka. I returned to Sri Lanka in 1977 after my studies. I faced a society with violence at various levels. I remember my first kind of career began when in August 1977, when post-election violence extended to violence against Tamils in Colombo. And I volunteered to work in a group called Citizens for National Harmony at the Center for Society and Religion. Now, from that beginning, I mean, I don't have to tell you that my database on violence kind of began to expand more and more and more. When I say violent, I mean both violence in society and also violence due to state repression. And I also must tell you that when you look at this database, what I have are only numbers and reports of certain incidents, especially collected by human rights groups. I myself was involved in starting a group called Inform in 1990 when we started seeing dead bodies in Colombo. So now and the second thing was right from the beginning, I started working on most of the initial work was within the plantation working class. which I actually started in while I was in Soviet Union, and I continued. And when you are working class in the plantation, you face ethnicity, class differences, what have you. Now, both this experience began lots of questions in my mind about how Sri Lanka, what I call essentialist categorization of a Sri Lankan state, that it's a democracy and it was as a welfare state, which is very commonly said, but I don't think kind of there's a serious analysis of what really went on. It is this what led me to that volume, Can Democracy Be Designed? I argue that in studying democracy, you should differentiate between democratic institutions, which we have, and democratic politics, which is an issue to do with power. Now, if you combine the two, you can raise a lot of questions by these liberals talking of Sri Lanka being a democracy. Same with the welfare state, because plantation workers right from the beginning. By the way, they were deprived of citizenship when post-colonial state defined our citizenship, which meant we didn't have universal franchise. It was, I think, somewhere in 2009. There's a report out from an institute in UK. Their final piece of legislation went through to ensure their citizenship, some sections. Then the second strand was, which motivated, I started questioning this whole idea of liberal peace. I mean, if you want, I will explain my criticism. I have written about it, which began to dominate in Sri Lanka, especially with the intervention of Western actors and the Norwegian mediation, which a lot of supporters like to call a peace process. I call it just another round of negotiation, was a high point of that. Now, the question of liberal peace also is happening in the field of peace and conflict studies. And I have been in touch with the peace and conflict studies tradition, especially in Sweden, because of my Uppsala link. And at the moment, then in 2019, I got linked with a project in University of Umeå in Sweden, which started. The project is called Varieties of Peace. I mean, they did a very interesting turn. What they argued was there are a lot of studies on conflicts and very often these conflict studies ultimate motivation is stability. But they started saying what is called peace is not theorized. Main theorization is that Galtung's one, positive peace, negative peace. We believe that actually stop people from thinking through what peace really means. So this project is called Varieties of Peace, which also means that you can't have a global blueprint of peace. You got to take the historical context into account. And end of 2019, we got together several countries in Indonesia, which are countries that have gone through some kind of a violence, some kind of violent past, and this now is supposed to be peaceful. But we asked researchers to go deep into what is meant by peace in those countries. Countries that were covered was Sri Lanka, South Africa, Aceh, Cambodia, Philippines, and Syria. So in each of these countries, people presented papers which went detail into the situation after so-called end of violence. It is into that I presented a paper with my colleague of mine at Umeå, Malin Kebo, looking at Sri Lankan conflict as a question of state formation. Now, for me, that wasn't very difficult, with just a small twist from what I've been writing, because I have written about Sri Lankan conflict as an issue of state, a problem of a centralized state, which we inherited from the British. So while there is ethnicity, while there are elements in aspects in society, but I always argued that reducing it to something happening in society, which is done by a lot of people even in this reconciliation business, totally ignores state, power within the state. So we totally ignore elite. how they control us, how do they manage to control a state. So I wrote a piece into that, and it came in the Journal of Peace Building and Development. There's a special issue out on these countries. So now that is a kind of basic motivation with pushed me into pulling, and I realized after I started working, I can expand to writing of the post-colonial state formation beyond the northern issue. And that's what I'm working on. And first I will explain my conceptual framework, and then I'll very briefly explain the kind of the outline of the work, and then we can have a discussion, and I hope I'll be able to hear you. Anyway, the fundamental question is conventional idea of looking at the state. Basically, look at it as a kind of a concrete, self-contained reality that has attained a final status. And also, once you draw a kind of a line around a country with a map, it's like a kind of a self-contained box, right? And the legal notion of sovereignty also strengthens that. Of course, those who control the state and their ideologues always try to convey the notion that this notion of eternal nature of the state, and a whole paraphernalia develop rituals, histories, symbols, flags, which to promote this idea. For some, defending this state is a kind of a lifelong ambition, drives them, and also I know this is also the approach taken by what I call realist school of international relations. Now, instead, in contrast, we argue state is as any social phenomenon, product of history. It has happened and it changes. It continues to change. And it is happened in particular historical periods in different parts of the world. And you can just look around the world to see that. I mean, I'm just tell you just recent example. The most important thing of the collapse of the former Soviet Union. I mean, I can spend a whole day talking about that. Versus breakdown of a state. There were 215 units. Then Yugoslavia, and Czechoslovakia. Those are. Then, if you look around the world, really the conflict studies. Used to look at state formation as state formation conflict, precisely those where there are attempts to bring diverse identity groups together into a single polity. And if you look at Uppsala as a database, if you look at the world is full of that kind of conflict. Even in the state, so-called state that are stable or final, there's always an ongoing debates, ongoing discussions about changes. A good example is where I'm living now. You must have heard about the Scottish Nationalist Party, and they're asking for another referendum. We are watching how it approach. So their states are results of, they're not kind of natural phenomena, result of struggles of results of political struggles. Then this whole state formation always takes place in an international context. It's almost impossible to understand state without taking. Moment we confine our mind into inside those lines of the map, you will totally ignore the outside world. For example, a lot of striking on Sri Lanka ignore the sea more than anything. Sea, India. So always this state formation takes place in a context of global context. I mean, just to add the example, Sri Lanka, we know the modern form of state is formed under the British, Then even independence. Independence happened not only because of what happened inside Sri Lanka, but because of the weakening of the British Empire from the time of the First World War. So that is another dimension that we always have to keep in mind. Now, the thing is, all those states are product of history. Once it forms, it has a degree of autonomy from the other societal process. I look at state more as a strategic space, um, which means um, they cannot be understood by reducing it to other phenomena in society. Now, here I more come to the Marxist tradition of studying the state within which I'm working, because earliest Marxist traditions looked at state as a product of capitalist development. Second, they went to there's a school of thought influenced by French structuralism, relative autonomy of Poulantzas is the most important example. Now there are more new studies of state by the more critical theorist Marxists looking at a autonomous power of the state. And my hero on that is Bob Yesop and actually critical political geographers. They do a lot of work on this particular area. So now then there comes the issue: how do you study this autonomous strategic space? I argue this strategic space emerges in a particular historical context, which means it's not the same in all states. So you can't have a global theory of state. Second, certain state society relations within the in this formational state become more strategic. And that's very important. Now, these strategic state society relations can be maintained either through coercion or consent. That's very important. Now, what happened is, of course, the ideas that legitimize the state, institutions, public policies all have influence of in this state-society relation. But when the state-society relations are able to manage, you're able to manage through consent, then the hegemony that legitimizes the state is strong. And when it is not strong, when it is weak, when the coercive power is used to maintain the state, then the hegemony is weak and it's a weak state. And there we come to another important idea of security. Now, often those who kind of glorify states and look at state as a um, eternal thing, what they mean by often security is the security of the state. Sometimes even the word national security is when there are no nation, only bits and pieces of nation. But moment you begin to look at a different way, consent and coercion, security becomes a very different concept. Security cannot be studied only by the security of the state, because sometimes promoting the security of the state undermines security of groups, individuals, and so on. And also current debate on security has expanded to include a lot of other dimensions. So we go away from very narrow idea of national security, which has been the one of the banes of Sri Lanka. Then, of course, finally, state needs resources to sustain itself. And this, in the country like Sri Lanka, has always been generated within the context of global capitalism. And we have had different strategies, and this, of course, given what's happening now, you can write a separate book on that, because in terms of ensuring economic security of the state, there are broadly one group argue that these are more liberal economies. You got to liberalize the economy and make use of the global system. The others give a more bigger role to play for the state. Now here I won't go detail into that. I can in the course of discussion if you want. But this is not a kind of a final state as one you can achieve. These are various strategies which get adopted at different time. And Sri Lanka is a very interesting case to study. Okay, in a case of underdeveloped economy like Sri Lanka, now this is where another interest of mine came into the picture. foreign aid become important in terms of ensuring the economic security of the state. And I'll just briefly mention how it changed, how it had an effect in the post-77 period. So now this is my broad conceptual framework, and I apply that to Sri Lanka with three strategic state-society relations. First one, of course, which everybody had written about in terms of much of the literature is on that, is the whole challenge of developing a challenge of a centralized state in a multi-ethnic society. I mean, I'm not going to go into great detail because that's have been written a lot. And just to remind, this whole problem began not only 1956 as country believe, as I mentioned, defining the post-colonial citizenship itself, how we define disenfranchised Indian Tamil population. And if you look at 1946 census, they were numerically higher than the Sri Lankan Tamils. So by the very first beginning of started, ethnicity and identity politics became a central in state formation process. Second variable I look at is electoral politics. Now, what is interesting is in electoral politics. Electoral politics is a method by which you manage, you choose rulers who control the state. Plus, also it's a mechanism of managing state-society relations. Now, in the countries where there have been a voting for a long time, I mean, I actually look at studies of Western Europe for a long time, it is seen that electoral politics, not the voter behavior only, political system, there are many places it has been able to transcend regional diversity, regional differences, and create what's called a national political space, and which is important in the state formation. But Sri Lanka is a case where right from the beginning, because of the dominance of ethnicity in the political system, Sri Lankan electoral politics was never able to construct a national political state, but it actually reconstructed ethnic political spaces. So actually, when I'm studying elections, it's much more relevant to not to look at Sri Lanka as a unified state, but to study the electoral results from the ethnic districts. I mean, broadly, singular majority districts, and always in our electoral system, almost 80% of the membership came from the singular majority area. And there is a Tamil majority district, which is North and Batiklo, and the mixed ethnic, which include Nuwara as well now. Now, so our electoral system was, electoral and political was never able to construct a national political state, so it didn't help in the state formation process. Finally, although electoral politics was not able to construct a national political state within the singular majority, it created a competitive political system. Where, I mean, if you look at even compared to international statistics, participation rate in election, number of parties that came was very, very high. And the process began from the 1930s, and which began to change regimes in power. Now, in that context, what happens is, in a country which was developing a capitalist, evolving in a capitalist economic system, I look at capitalism as a historical process. I studied through what's called historical institutionalism, where actually institutions change to make market the primary mechanism of sharing resources. Distributing resources, and then once it happens in certain areas, it becomes a hegemonic way. People think it's a natural thing. But in a country where because capitalism always distribution is unequal, singular majority, although their identity was important in formation of the state, and and they form the majority in terms of the electoral system. But because they benefit unequally from the capitalist transition, the ruling class always found it necessary to manage relations with the politically powerful groups within the single majority through various policies. Those are what we call, came to be identified as a welfare state, which is actually an unfortunate term. This was a term that LSSP brought from UK in the 1930s. What we have is very different. But major social groups that began at that moment were the peasantry, and also the what we call intermediate classes. Actually, these current reforms of the state is to try and manage politics with them. So this process with singular majority was always possible to manage this when the economy was doing economy linked to the global capitalism generated enough revenue and able to manage it. But we have a string of events in our history, starting from the Hartal, which state is unable to do that, and what you have is often protest and all that from society and state repression. So broadly, that is the third variable within kind. I'll just briefly mention the structure of the study, and probably then we could have a discussion. I begin with a very brief account of the colonial period, where the main element of the post-colonial state was established. But in that one, I also point to a very important thing which a lot of people don't take into account. See, if you look at 1946 census, when we got independent, 80% of the population lived in the same area where the bulk of the plantation agriculture was. Plantation agriculture meant, remember, tea, rubber, coconut. And tea, smallholder, upcountry, mid-country, low country. Rubber in different sizes, and coconut. Now, it is that from that area, the whole demand for protecting the peasantry, and also if your agriculture is not productive enough, formal sector job demand became the main demand. And the turning point was the last economic global crisis, 1930s. So I cover briefly that one. Then secondly, I cover these three variables that three, and also international context. I said 4 variables for the period between colonialism, end of colonialism, and just before 77. Now, I'll end with this last comment, because post 77 becomes for me, a qualitatively new period of state formation. Because on one hand, UNP came to power with a majority due to the peculiarities of the electoral system, not only shifted the economy to a new period of capitalist transition where markets and open game, also changed for the purpose of pushing the economy, change the political system, presidential system and PR system of election. I'll explain to you how they are linked later, but I have written about it in my other work. Second, it also the same election when the Tamils demanded a separate state. Same election. And 77 was election. 79, we have a Prevention of Terrorism Act, notion of terrorism becoming internalized, and we still have that. And of course, there are other important issues. Because of liberalization, we had a very, very generous support from the donors. And I'm arguing in that section from 1977 till Norwegian peace was started, external support actually helped the state to manage 2 things. One is, while changing some of the macroeconomic policies, like poverty alleviation becoming the dominant discourse on social policy, manage kind of massive infrastructure project, state-led, manage relation with the single majority while carrying on these economic policies, also to wage an expensive war. Now, foreign support to a war need not come only to support directly support to a military, because if the foreign assistant takes care of other costs of the state can use its own resources for its for military purpose. Actually, this was raised first very strongly in the 1987 review of the Norwegian aid, and that review, which was done by University of Bergen, was one of the important turning points of the Norwegian getting interested in the whole issue. But then that period ended up with a economic crisis on 2001 and what to call Norwegian-led liberal peace. Well, it's a collapse of the liberal peace, actually, that allowed Rajapaksa to come to power. And then we had the post-war. My last chapter is a post-war state, which it begins with the consolidation or territory of the centralized state through military means. None of the problems have been resolved of the minority issues, and of course, that whole process itself has generated its own crisis of the capitalist transition process, and now we are in the middle of it. Now, I know that now these are very detailed. I go into very detail empirically for these sections, but let me end my brief presentation with this couple. When I look at Sri Lanka now, when I came recently, it's a society where there are what I call a crisis is not just an economic crisis. It's manifested in various spheres, various ways. Sometimes I felt when I came, I remember what 83 happened, 83 anti-Tamil pogrom took place. We realized, some of us in several organizations, that something substantial shift has taken place. And we got together for a workshop for about 4 days. And it led to quite a lot of new thinking, new ideas, and new research. However, I always felt that we need in Sri Lanka at the moment a similar exercise among us. And I must tell you, when I came back, I kind of renewed my links with SSA. And I think SSA has just called for a they set up papers of how to take our democratic discussion, democracy beyond the talk of law and institutions, because that is one part of the crisis that I'm facing. So I simply think it's time for us to sit down and think through certain fundamentals. And I think then the work has to be done not only in Sri Lanka, but internationally as well. There are enough of crisis happening like that. And because I always look at international dimension being important, I'll end my comment with how I see the international dimension first. Capitalism always have gone through crisis one after the other. We are seeing another one globally out there. Even developed capitalist countries are struggling to ensure funds for public services. And then of course there are strike. I just heard France has used presidential decree to change their not only going through parliament, going to change their the age of retirement. Inequality is very high as a result of capitalism. I think Piketty's work is the best independent. Then what's happening is expenditure on arms is going up in a massive while this is happening. As you can look at the CEPA database, is the best that I've been monitoring it all over the world. And finally, of course, the destruction of the environment. I mean, today I was listening environment issues in 6 African countries in a Al Jazeera. So let me end. It's a very pessimistic note, I know, but at the same time, I have a feeling one of the things I like to see is how our organization getting together to think through this larger picture, both in Sri Lanka and abroad, and think what new areas of work we should be doing. Thank you.
Okay,
And
just before we leave, I just want to announce our next RRP. It's on understanding livelihood studies by Dr. Nevis Moraes, who's a senior economist at the Department of Social Studies of the Open University of Sri Lanka. It will be on the 20th of April after the New Year at 3:30 p.m. So thank you very much all for joining. Have a nice weekend.